we're going to get started. Um, Thank you for joining us. I am Christy Ingram, and I am the Family Workforce Development Coordinator for Families Together New York State. And today's webinar is entitled Engaging with Families Involved with Child Welfare. This is being hosted by Families Together New York State and CTAC and presented by Ashley Sindone along with Ginger Malloy, both from Families Together New York State. So we are very excited to have Ashley and Ginger speak to us about engaging with families involved in child welfare. I am going to pass it on to Ashley to get us started.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Ashley Sindoni. I am the Family Workforce Development Coordinator at Families Together here. And I just want to give you a little bit of my background information. I've been with Families Together since January. I live in upstate New York, a little bit north of Syracuse, if anyone knows where that is. Before working with Families Together, I was a parent educator, sorry. And I work closely with Department of Social Services. So I was able to see, what families experienced on a different side, kind of more the DSS side. And now, I realize how important it is for families that we engage with to have that support in the family peer advocate role. So I was able to see it from both sides. I'm very excited to share with you all today and talk about this very important subject. And I will pass it on to Ginger to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ginger Malloy. I am the family policy advisor for OCFS for Families Together of New York State, and I'm stationed at the Albany Regional Office at OCFS. What I do is I just provide the family voice, to policies, procedures. I help with some of the parents that might call in that might have, complaints there, a lot of different things. But the main thing is that my lived experience enables me to, work in this field. Before this, I was a prevention worker and a parent partner. And so I've had the lived experience with, having child welfare involvement in myself. And I also have the lived experience for the last 15 years of working with families in the communities. So I have a broader insight of, what family needs are, which is a good thing, which helps, with creating policies and procedures and, different things that the families needs in the community. So that's about it.
Thank you so much, Ginger. We're very excited to have you with us today. And her insight has been so valuable in creating this training. So we're very excited. So learning objectives. What do we want to talk about today? So upon completion of this training, we want participants to possess a comprehension of the following. So how to use trauma-informed approach when a family has had experience working with Child Protective Services. How to address safety concerns while maintaining a relationship with the family. So what happens when those safety concerns do come up? How to confront stigma, fear, and mistrust around CPS or Child Protective Services. And lastly, how to foster a collaborative relationship between Child Protective Services and the family. We really want to take away that me versus you mentality and kind of create a team. So the first thing we're going to talk about are some definitions. These definitions are some that you may see when working with families. These are some definitions that the families may see. Why are we going over these? The more we know, the more we can help our families, right? So we are going to be going over some of these definitions in the next few slides. So the first thing we're going to do is play a matching game. I will read a definition and you can feel free to use your chat and tell me what definition from the word bank below you feel matches that definition. And we will give you the correct answers. So the first definition we're going to go over is the state agency responsible for handling reports, investigations, and services related to child maltreatment. Is that CPS? Is that mandated reporter? Is that state welfare agency or is that investigation? I see we have a lot of CPS coming in. I got a couple of state welfare agencies coming in.
Somebody said all of them. OCFS, state welfare, OCFS, all.
Okay. So that one, the state agency is the it could be either or CPS or it could be state welfare agency. So there was a lot of correct answers. Sorry, I lost my mouse. I can't find it. There it is. I'm using two screens too, so sometimes my mouse disappears. Sorry about that. Okay, good. And the next is a Child Protective Services response that gathers facts to determine if a child was at risk of being maltreated and whether intervention is needed. Is that going to be a mandated report or will that be investigation? I see a lot of investigations, a lot of investigation.
CPS. Mostly investigation from the comments.
Yeah, great. So that is right. So an investigation is when, a report has been made and now a preventative worker has to come in or a CPS worker has to come in and they have to investigate. They can't just say, something has been done or something hasn't been done. They really have to gather the facts. So that's what that is, investigation. Great job. Yes. So the first one is a professional legally required to report child abuse or neglect to authorities. I
And
see a
we have
lot.
yep, a mandated reporter.
Yeah, a lot of mandated reporters in the comments. That's right. So a mandated reporter is somebody who is legally responsible to report it if they see something or neglect or abuse. And then lastly, an agency required by law to investigate child abuse or neglect reports and intervene to protect children when necessary.
CPS, we have state welfare agency.
Yeah, and that is state welfare agency, but that one and CPS can kind of go back and forth. So, state welfare agency is an agency required by law to investigate reports of
Yeah,
neglect, and intervene. So, state welfare agency is the agency, and then you have the Child Protective Services where they send the workers out, if that makes sense. So great. Okay. So we didn't think these were going to work, but I guess they did. So there's the correct answers. Okay. Then we are going to go over substantiated versus unsubstantiated. What do these words mean? Sometimes you might hear founded or unfounded. So once a report is created, somebody makes a report against the family we're working with, an investigation must take place. So somebody has to come out, they have to investigate like we had said. This can be a very confusing and it could be a traumatizing time for the family, when a CPS report is made, it could be scary for anybody. Yes, they also use indicated or not indicated. I do see that in the chat. So there's a couple different words that might be used. Thank you so much for that. So, the family, they might get a letter in the mail that says, you've had a report that's founded, unfounded. And what does that mean? That they could they could panic. This is something, if we know these words, we're able to help the family understand what those mean and kind of guide them through it. So substantiated or maybe founded is where the investigation took place and it concluded that there was an allegation of child mistreatment and that there was credible evidence that supports that. So they do believe that there was abuse or neglect that occurred. So if you see substantiated or founded, that means they did find the abuse, they did find the evidence to support the neglect or abuse, right? Unsubstantiated or unfounded is when the investigation takes place and they determine that there's not enough not enough evidence to say that yes, this did really happen. So that comes in, and a family might, again, they might be traumatized by this. They might be afraid. What does this mean? So when you see unsubstantiated or unfounded or some of those other words that we saw in the chat, it means that, there wasn't enough evidence, and nothing regarding that report, nothing else really happens. And so hopefully that can help our families a little bit. So I'm going to pass it over to Ginger, and she's going to talk to us in the next couple of slides.
Hi, everybody. So I just want to take a step back here. Like this webinar is about engaging with families involved in child welfare. And we know when the families, are involved in child welfare or with CPS, they're not really trusting anybody. Most of the time that they will, we have lived experience, so we can kind of talk to parents or caregivers in a way that the workers, through CPS or the other service providers really can't. So we pretty much have the best hope of being able to get through to the family and helping them and teaching them, what's going on, providing them knowledge so that they're able to advocate for themselves. But in the meantime, we help advocate for them, right? So what we're doing now is we're talking about different definitions that we need to be clear on so that we can provide the family with the information that's accurate so that they understand what CPS is saying to them. I mean, how many times have we been involved with, the families and the CPS worker, and neither one is understanding each other. We're kind of like the interpreters sometimes. So I wanted to go over like abuse. What does abuse mean? Like exactly. When I started, I really wasn't, sure what qualified for abuse, what didn't qualify for abuse. So, I've learned about it, and these are the exact like definitions of what abuse is. It's an intentional act by a caregiver that causes or can cause serious physical, emotional, or sexual harm. That's pretty much it in a nutshell. The next few definitions go over what different types of abuse is there. Sorry about that. And the abuse must involve the person that's legally responsible for the child. That's the main focus too. Abuse is active. It's about what's being done, not what was done, what might possibly have, but it's about what's being done. So we'll go to neglect next. So what is neglect? Neglect is failure to provide a child with basic needs or supervision to avoid harm. That's a really, really, really broad statement, right? So, we could kind of break it down to specifics or, situations that we've seen in the past, and a lot of things that we might think are neglect are on the borderline that aren't. So we need to make sure that the families, are aware of where they're heading, if they're heading towards a neglect charge, and point it out to them and try to help them so that they can overcome situations before the situations occur. So like extreme lack of food, what is extreme lack of food? It's when the family has absolutely nothing in the house. Some people might think extreme lack of food is 2 cabinets, that aren't filled with food. So there's a lot of shades of gray through, what is neglect. Excessive drug or alcohol use that impacts their ability to care for the child. Now, I know it's a touchy subject, but if a parent is drinking and it's not impacting their ability to care for the child, is that neglect? There's different kinds, like I said. So we always want to, ask other people, talk to the parents if you see something that might not be, looking right or might be, heading towards neglect. So one of the key principles is that poverty alone is not neglect unless help is refused. So, I think you can understand what that kind of means. And unless help is refused is the key point in that statement. Another key point is neglect is passive. It's not about what's being done. It's about what's not being done. How are you not caring for your child to provide safety, well-being and permanency? Permitted chronic absenteeism from school. Now, from my experience, I know a lot of families, the older child will stay home a lot to care for the younger children to help mom out. A lot of that is cultural. because that's what the parents have done like in the past, and they think it's okay. But what is chronic? What is regular attendance? Like, maybe we can kind of find other sources, if that's a situation, for childcare to help the parent be able to care for the child without keeping the older children out of school. So these are just, ideas that I'm kind of going through. So, to provide kind of examples of what neglect is. So the next thing is maltreatment. Now, for me, maltreatment, I couldn't quite get that for a while, because maltreatment pretty much is like, it's like the umbrella, like it's neglect is underneath it. You could interchange the words, so if you see maltreatment, I personally just kind of think about the word neglect instead. So maltreatment refers to the caregiver's failure to meet the minimum degree of care required to keep a child safe and healthy. Like I said, they're interchangeable. It's also observing unsafe caregiving patterns, such as abandonment for a child. Like, these are all things to think about. What is there an age that you're supposed to leave the child home, or not? There's the child's maturity level. There's different things that go into these definitions. So I feel we really need to be careful with before making a call. The best thing to do is support a family before reporting a family, and I'm sure you've all heard that before. The key point is maltreatment is about the quality of the care that the child receives. So the next point we want to talk about is, who's changing the slides?
Oh, there we go.
Okay. Like statistics. These are just a couple things from 2024. Like almost 150,000 child protective services reports were made in New York State. Out of that, like I'd say 80% of them were made by mandated reporters. And that most of the reports are by schools, by school staffs. That's where the majority of the reports come from. Only 30,000 about were substantiated. 93,000 were unsubstantiated. That means that they did not go in and do a full investigation. Children were 13,000 were in foster homes. Now that's old, with Family First and the kinship, the really big push. Thank God for placing child with families or other supportive adults that are close to the families. That number, I'm sure, has gone down greatly. So there was some other. Oh, another thing is like, and guys, you just see I'm kind of like winging this, So if anybody wants to interrupt, that's fine. I'll check the chat. Another thing is like, we were talking about poverty is not neglect, and we were kind of hitting on that point. There's a large percentage of children in the Black and Hispanic communities, and it's disproportionately represented among the neglect cases. So there's a video that I'm hoping to interject into the chat here. It's called "Poverty is Not Neglect." Kind of a little quirky, but it's a really, it meant a lot to me when I read it. So I just wanted to share it, with you guys, that maybe you would be, interested in it. So I'm going to give it back to Ashley. She's going to talk about trauma-informed care a little bit.
Thanks, Ginger. And yes, everyone will receive, you can see these slides on CTAC's website. And some of these statistics, we do have the references for those. You can see those in the reference slides. So you will get information to where we got this. But that is very good points. And I thank you, Ginger, for the helpful information.
Does anybody have any questions before we move on? I just wanted to throw that out there.
I think we're going to have people chat in questions so that we can go through them at the end of the webinar.
Okay.
So feel free to throw them in the chat.
Yeah, any questions can be thrown right in the chat. So now we have a little bit of background on some of the words we might see from CPI, or I'm sorry, some of the definitions involved with child welfare. We have some statistics about what families in New York State are experiencing. And now we're going to think about the role of the FPA when working with these families. How can we as FPAs or family peer advocates help these families? We want to be trauma informed the last thing any of us really want to do is re-traumatize a family, right? We want to keep in mind that we're not counselors, we're not psychologists, we're family peer advocates, we're peers, but we can still come in with a family, a trauma-informed approach. So what does that look like? So the FPA recognizes signs and signs of trauma and the impact of trauma. And we can go over some of those momentarily. Child welfare being involved can cause fear of judgment. We want to make sure that we are keeping that in mind, that people, the families that we're working with might be fearful of that, right? So being trauma informed also means being sensitive to the needs of the individuals while taking into consideration their culture and history. Like I said, the last thing we want to do is re-traumatize a family. When we see, or the family might tell us what they've been through, we can pay attention to that. We can ask the family what their triggers are, or maybe we can see some of the things that trigger them. And we'll be going over some of the triggers and culture in a little bit, but we can pay attention to that, and we can be empathetic and understanding. We can listen to the family story. To embody a trauma-informed approach as a family peer advocate acknowledges the impact of the trauma on the family. So we can understand, maybe they say, they've had a bad experience with service providers in the past, whether it's child welfare or somebody else, we can understand that. And we can aim to create an understanding and supportive environment. So that's what we want to do. And that might mean sharing your lived experience if some of that relates to them, and when appropriate to do so. Christy, can you change the slide? I lost slide control.
So what would trigger a trauma response in one of our parents or caregivers? These are some things that I recall happening, like CPS knocking at the door. You hear that certain knock. It's things that you could remember. Official letters in the mail. If you get something and it's from the county and you open it up and you really don't understand what it's talking about, or you see that, you're going to be charged with neglect or abuse and you really don't know kind of what neglect and abuse is, or, they're, they're, they're traumatizing, they're things that our parents remember, especially if they've been involved in CPS previously. Suggesting more services for the family, like if we don't want to overwhelm the family, or if they're saying, okay, you got to see this person, you got to see that person, and how are you going to meet this person while you're trying to work or care for your kids, that's another form of trauma that could possibly occur. So just as long as we're aware of that, there may be previous trauma from being involved in child welfare services in the past, that we can acknowledge it going forward and have some empathy for the family as they've been going through this. The flashbacks of traumatic experiences that may have happened to them or their children, and fear of the unknown. That to me is a big one. Like if we don't know what's going to happen, that's why I'm a big one. Like to let's provide the families with as much knowledge about what the process may be as we can in order to support and help them. If you don't know what this information is or what they're going to do, or if you're in court and you have no idea what's going to happen, that's really fearful. It's worse than what reality is. Well, for me anyway, it's a lot worse than for what reality is. So, these are just points that we kind of need to be aware of, that, so that we can help the family, we can support the family. So what's the next slide?
Yeah, and I just, if you don't mind, I want to jump in, suggesting more services for the family, something that kind of stands out to me. And, how can that be a trauma response? So, you're working with a family, maybe they're working with child welfare, and they suggest, hey, you really need to have this person or this person. And what does that mean to the family? The family might start questioning themselves. Am I not doing something right? What am I doing wrong? So that's how that creates that trauma response is, maybe in the past they've had services because of a CPS report. So things like that are things we really want to think about. I just want to kind of open it up also, if you don't mind, to the group. Are there anything else that you all can think of that you have seen or that may have caused a trauma response that we can think about? What are some things that may have caused a trauma response when working with child welfare or things you might have seen?
One of the things for me too was, when we talked about suggesting more services for the family, I was trying to take care of my children. I was trying to bring them to appointments. I was working full time. And now, I have to meet with this person and that person. And, how do I do all that? But with working with my workers and, understanding CPS's role, I was able to, we were all able to work together. Like we met on lunchtime at McDonald's a lot of the times, so, or
Yeah.
they would be able to extend their hours maybe one night a week.
Yeah, somebody in the chat said when police arrive, that's a big one. Home alarms. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, those are some triggers that we can see with our families.
Right. And understanding from the family's point of view, which we all have, like, do we want to have, a CPS car sitting out front of our house? So now everybody in the community knows that CPS is involved, with us, and that's the point where we kind of engage the families with their workers. And we could point this out to the CPS workers and say, hey, think about how the family might feel. How would you feel? Put yourself in their shoes.
Yeah, and we have some really great answers in the chat that I just kind of want to point out. Someone said home visits in general, and that is a big one. And that's something we definitely talk about. Is someone coming into your home can be traumatizing to you, especially if you've had bad past experiences. Not understanding the language, again, huge, right? You have somebody coming in your home, you don't know the language, so you're not completely sure of what they're saying. You might feel like you're in trouble. Definitely some stigmas associated, around culture. Some people are scared to have strangers come in their homes. That's absolutely right. That could go for both men and women. Having someone you don't know come into your home, the fear of judgment's there, but also the fear of danger, right? Supervised visits, that's a great answer also.
Actually, I think somebody had their hand up a minute ago.
Oh, Crystal, you can go ahead and unmute.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Well, my question was when someone wrote in the chat about language, I just feel like our parents that we support, need to join a lot of these, trainings and different things, or if they can have something like a hard copy of these things so they can know the language and get familiarized with it. And that way we can see change in their behavior or their motivation, I would say, and efforts in completing their services and things of that nature. So they won't feel like they're getting beat up on, when everyone calls. It's always going to be a trigger every time anyone from the agency call them, even though that's a requirement, it's also a trigger for them as well. But I feel like if they understand the language and understand the work that we have to do, it would be a better outcome.
Right, Crystal. Knowledge is power, right?
Yeah,
absolutely.
For the CTAC and Families Together webinars, we always encourage providers. You can always bring families with you. You can share the webinar with families when you are meeting with them and share the slides if that's most effective. But we really encourage family participation when it's appropriate.
Yeah, thank you for all the answers. You're more than welcome to continue to use the chat. So we're going to be talking about 4 types of trauma responses. You may be asking, like, what does this have to do with anything? These are ways different people respond to trauma in different ways, right? So here are 4 common ways. They're not all the ways, but these are common ways that people might respond to trauma. And when we understand that a response that the family we're working with is might be a trauma response, we can equip ourselves to better help that family, right? We're going to look at these 4 types of trauma responses, and we're going to talk about how it relates to the family peer advocate work and some of the things you may have seen in the past. So the first one I'd like to talk about is the fight response. So maybe you've been working with a family for a while. Maybe you just got a new referral for a family and they're experiencing a fight response. So what that might look like is they're confrontational. Maybe they're on the phone with you and they're like, listen, I don't want anyone coming in my house. They're very upset. Perhaps you might see that. They might not be yelling or kicking, but they might be, maybe sassy, maybe like, listen, I don't trust you. I don't want you in my house. So a fight response doesn't necessarily mean loud and yelling. They might be quiet and not want you in their house. Maybe they don't want service providers in their home at all. So what can we do to work through this as a family peer advocate? So first thing, we need to meet the family where they're at. So we're going to assess our own safety first. Actually, we're going to assess our own safety, make sure that it is safe for us to go there. If the family is not comfortable at this time, maybe they're not in a place where it's safe for you to meet them there, we're going to assess that. Then we're going to meet the family where they're at. So maybe if they are not comfortable with you going to the home, can we meet them in public at first? How can we help this family overcome this fear or this response? So maybe it's meeting them in public. We can start to build trust with this family, and that, and all of these responses, building trust might be sharing our own lived experience. And if you're not comfortable sharing your lived experience, you can just share what the definition of a family peer advocate is. What is the work you're doing that explains to them that you are a peer, that you have been through things before, and maybe it's not the same situation that they're experiencing, but maybe you felt those same feelings of fear, sadness before. So we can relate to them in that way if you're not comfortable sharing your full lived experience. And I just want to take note also with these that it might take a long time to build that family's trust. So, don't get discouraged. Meet that family where it's at and do your best to help and support their family. But, especially if they've been traumatized in the past, that might be a hard thing for them to overcome. And honestly, in the work that we do with them, the truth behind it is they might not overcome that fear of service providers while we're working with them. And that's nothing on us. Specifically, we just want to do our best to help that family, and it might be a long road for them to really gain the trust of others, especially when they've been traumatized. Next is the flight. What does the flight look like? So if I ask everyone in this group, I bet many of us, if not all of us, can say that we've, had a family where maybe we've gotten referral, or maybe we're working with a family and something traumatizing happens and they just stop returning your calls. They don't want to talk to you. It might be, they might start canceling appointments. It might seem like they're avoiding us and you're like, what did I do? It might be that flight. They might be very, very fearful. There could be a number of reasons why a family may avoid us or not answer our calls or cancel. But one of the reasons might be that they are in flight mode. Whether it's a report was made against them, or something happened, they got a call, maybe they got a letter. Some of those trigger responses, maybe something like that happened. The next is to freeze, and what that would look like. Sorry, let me go back. I didn't tell you how to overcome the flight, right? So again, we want to meet the family where they're at. We could share our own lived experience, and we want to slowly work on gaining the trust of that family. So those same responses. And now freeze, freeze might look like is the family might not be able to make any decisions on their own. So there might be times when we're working with a family and they rely heavily on the family peer advocate. So they might ask you, if you try to direct them. They might ask you to make decisions for them. They might rely heavily on you to do things for them. Maybe they call you all the time because they're just so frozen. They don't know the right thing to do. They don't know the wrong thing to do. Maybe they're afraid of making a decision because they're afraid of getting in trouble, or, maybe I'll make the wrong decision. So we want to just really watch for that. And how can we work through the freeze? My biggest thing is family-driven care. So the work that we're doing, family-driven care, means putting that family in the driver's seat, letting them know that they're the expert on their child. Sometimes parents don't know that. I didn't know that initially, that I was the expert on my child. When you're meeting with doctors or child welfare, nobody tells you that you're the expert, that you know your child best. That family, if they're having a trauma response, they probably don't know that they are the expert on their child. So remind them of that. And we might need to remind them often. Remind them of the positive things they're doing. We really want to build that family's confidence. We want to give them a voice. We want them to start advocating for themselves. And that might be a very slow process. But slowly we can gain their trust and start working on those things. And then fawn. Fawn is when they're people pleasers, right? So people, you can be a people pleaser for many reasons. But when the family is agreeing to everything, whether it's helpful for their family or not, that might be a trauma response. So what could that look like? Maybe they go to an IEP meeting and the school is suggesting something ridiculous that they know that they can't meet. And they'll just agree to it. That might be like a people pleasing or fawn response. Child welfare comes in and they ignore the family's culture and says, you have to do things this way. And the family does it, even though it's uncomfortable. It's not maybe their culture or socially what they're used to doing. That might be a trauma response too. And so how can we help the family overcome that type of response? We can, again, teach a family they're the expert. We really want to, again, build their confidence. We want the family to know that it's okay to say how they live their life. So really addressing some of those biases, some of the stigmas that we might be seeing. And then we want to, one of the things that has been helpful for me is determine whether something is unacceptable or disagreeable. Something that's disagreeable might be something that you might not do, or some of the service providers might not do. Maybe it's specific to that family's culture or tradition or socially acceptable for them. So that is something that might be disagreeable to you. Then unacceptable is something that really is a safety risk, and we can get more into that later. So really talking about unacceptable or disagreeable. Okay, so how can we as family career advocates be trauma informed? So what can we do? Active listening. So listening to that family story, listening to where they came from, what happened to them. When we listen, without talking, just active listening, we can listen and we can understand. And then empathy. So, understanding that the family has had trauma in the past, acknowledging that and doing what we can to not re-traumatize that family. I know somebody had mentioned a phone call might be traumatizing, right? So we just want to be cautious of these things. We want to be understanding of these things. And just really kind of watch what we're doing and watch what's important to the family. Sharing your lived experience. You can share your story again, or you can share, like, if you're not comfortable sharing your story, you can just share that we are peers and that, we have felt some of the same feelings family is feeling, meeting the family where they're at. That just means, it might be taking baby steps. So you might see very slow progress. Maybe the family doesn't want to meet you in their home at first. So we meet them in public for a month. And then, slowly work into the family's home as we gain their trust, and being transparent. So a big part of meeting the family where they're at and gaining their trust is being transparent with the family. The family most likely knows that we are mandated reporters. We might have to tell them that when we first meet with the family, but being transparent about it and letting the family know that we're there to support them. We're not just coming in and we're not going to look for, what they're doing wrong. We're there to support them and help them grow.
Right. And also, being transparent is hard. We have to give the family the truth. And it's really not an easy thing to do. And you have to kind of say it delicately, which we knew I have trouble with that. But 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 it's the best thing to do, is just to be real. I mean, that's one of the best compliments you can get as FPAs, is when the families say, my worker is real, and that they appreciate that. They want to know the truth. They don't want you to lie to them, or, well, not that you're going to lie to them, but they don't want you to like sugarcoat stuff,
Yeah.
So really just, tell them the truth. And when you were talking about the Ashley, the active listening, sometimes we're listening, but we're not hearing them. We're listening to be able to provide a response to them, instead of really, hearing them, seeing where they're coming from, understanding. And that's a better way that we could all support families, right? So, okay,
Yeah.
I'll let you go. I'm sorry.
Thank you for that. Over
So you
here.
want to talk about the principles for trauma-informed care?
Yeah.
All
Yep.
right.
Sorry, I just lost my spot.
Okay.
Okay, so we are going to be talking about the 7 principles of trauma and trauma-informed care and how these relate to our work as family peer advocates. So first, we're going to discuss safety. So we want to make sure that we are safe going in a family's home, but we want to make sure that the family also knows that they are safe with us. Make them feel safe. And again, part of that is being transparent, which leads me to the next point of trustworthiness and transparency. As Ginger said, it's hard to be transparent, but we can explain, that we're mandated reporters, but our primary goal is to help the family to learn and grow. When safety concerns come up, we can discuss it with the family right away, let them know their information is confidential, and work on building trust with the family. Peer support. So when appropriate, we can share our life experience. You also may connect the family to other peer support groups in the area. Maybe your agency has groups like this that they can join, or they can talk to other families who are in the same or similar positions as them. And then collaboration. So we always want the family to be in the driver's seat. We want the family to kind of guide the way and direction they are going. We can collaborate with the family, and we can help them to collaborate with their team of support. So other service providers, we can kind of build a bridge and help the family collaborate with those service providers, but we really want to push that family-driven care and letting the family know that they're experts, and they take the driver's seat, but really collaborating with others as well. And empowerment, which is probably my favorite one. We really want to teach the family that they're the expert. They're in the driver's seat. We want to help them to use their voice. This year, when I first started with Families Together, I was able to attend Family Empowerment Day in Albany, and I don't know if anyone else went, but it was my first time, and it was amazing. It was amazing to see all the families come together. There was, caregivers, parents there. There was children there talking. It was just amazing to see that. And really, I feel like it gives the family their voice and lets them know that they're heard. And we got to chant through the hallways. Some people got to talk to leaders and people in high power. If you're able to bring your families or go with families to events like that, it is so empowering. But also, work with the family if they want to share their story, help them to do that, and encourage them to do that, and use their voice, which again is the next point is voice and choice. This is a little bit similar to empowerment. But we want the family to use their voice to make the choice with their family. So families are not one size fits all. We've talked a lot so far about culture, right? Culture, social, traditional things, aspects to a family. We want the family to be able to choose how they live their lives, So, just because a family might have a culture or a tradition that's different than ours, it doesn't necessarily make it bad. So we want them, again, to be in the driver's seat and choose how they live. So the next is cultural history and gender sensitivity. So we can acknowledge any biases that we may have. And sometimes it's hard. Sometimes we don't even know that we have biases. I remember in my last position, we took like a implicit bias test, and I was so surprised by it because, sometimes we have predetermined thoughts about things, and we don't even realize that we have some of those. So maybe pay attention to some of your own biases, but also help the family to speak up when they see those biases, whether it's another service provider. We really kind of want to teach a family to speak up and speak out, and it's okay to correct people if they don't meet the family where they're at as far as their culture goes. So we want to be sensitive, we want to be empathetic, and again, I'm going to come back with asking if something is disagreeable or unacceptable. And then I will go to the next slide. And Ginger, I'm going to pass it over to you for challenging perceptions. Ginger's going to share a story with us.
Right. And as we're talking about challenging perceptions, go back to you, Ashley, like what's acceptable or what's not acceptable or what's disagreeable. What are our culture, our thoughts, our biases, our stigmas involved here? Different things based on the way that we were raised or that we know of could be challenging. Is it a safety threat? There's all different kinds of, and there's again a lot of shades of gray here. So you really need to kind of, be careful with, is it a safety threat or is it just a challenging behavior? I've called workers, I've called my supervisors and say, hey, if this situation happened, what do you think? And a lot of the times it was like, Ginger, that's just based on your feelings, what you know. That's not really a safety threat, So I mean, there are the main ones, like corporal punishment, broken bones, but really lack of water or heat if it's summertime. And do we really need to be concerned about heat? Do we need to be concerned about water? Yeah, but maybe before it becoming a safety threat where they're living in unsafe, situations, let's try to have the family, make a call to the landlord or call code enforcement. What I've done a lot of times is I've just handed them the phone with the phone number as it's ringing, so that they know that it's again going back to empowering the families, so that they can make the call before it becomes, a safety threat. A lot is again homelessness and poverty. Is that a safety threat? It matters where you are. If you're living on the street, actually, at the bus stop with your children, yeah, it's unsafe. But if you're in a one of the hotels or if you're in some kind of transitioning situation with your children and you're taking care of them properly, then it's just maybe a challenging situation that we can help the family go through. So these are just some of the different kinds that could be safety threats or could be challenging situations. And if anybody has any other things, please chime in the chat or get yourself off mute. We'd love to hear from you because I find that that's the best way that I learn is from each one of you, from each other person. We're all peer advocates. We all work with families. So if you let us know what your thoughts are or things that you've encountered, that would be great, and it would help each other so that we're better empowered to help the families that we serve.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing. And one of the things, so when we were creating this, one of the things that really had me thinking is that over on that challenging side, you see where it says difficult chores. So I live in a rural area, and we have some Amish out our way. And if you ever drive by in the summer, you'll see little 4 and 5-year-old kids who are out working, and they will be out working in the fields all day long. And that's just their culture. And I had mentioned before to one of my coworkers, I'm like, wow, that just seems, wrong. And she pointed out my bias. bias, that's their culture. And so that really got us thinking about this, where sometimes, things might be challenging to us. It might not be something we do. It might not be something we agree with. It really made me think and question myself, about that, and just pointing out those biases. I didn't even know I had it, but just some of those, like Ginger said, poverty, it can be challenging. If the families, are they safe? Are they willing to accept the help? There's some, these can be controversial. It's kind of like Ginger said, it's a gray area. There's no black or white. Um, yeah.
We could also talk about you telling a story. I had with food deprivation. One of the CPS calls that I got when my child was about 7 years old was the school called on me because my son went into school every day hungry and they were feeding him breakfast. And he was saying, well, mom doesn't have any food at home, So CPS came in, they investigated, they saw that I had food. And the real story was mom does not have any food at home that I like right now. So that was, the situation. So, again, we've got to be, careful. Is it a safety threat, or is it just a child saying that mom doesn't have any food at home, So we need just to be aware and maybe ask questions before, thinking that it's a safety threat or, somebody, making a report that it is a safety threat. So let's just kind of like look into the situations a little bit more, and support the families. So, and
Yeah.
teach them to advocate for themselves, So
Yeah.
anyway,
And
I just
somebody,
think about
oh,
that. I was
sorry.
just sharing it. Go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay. Somebody said in the slide or in the chat, my son does this. If you have children, if you've been around children, children can say some things, right? They can say some things that are kind of off the cuff. They can say some things that are surprising. So if we if we went and called CPS every time we heard a child say something that might be, potentially harmful, we might be on the phone all the time because kids can come up with some crazy stories. So it's really paying attention and asking those curious questions. My friend Christy over here, she gave me that word, curious questions, asking questions, really diving into it, checking our own biases. We're there to support the family, right? So this we just want to put this up because this is really, again, it could be really controversial, and we just really want people to think, is something a safety threat? Is it challenging to us? Kind of knowing the difference and knowing to ask those questions.
I see
Somebody
Christy
said,
put the bias test in the chat too.
it's one of my
Yeah.
favorites.
Yeah, it's interesting. A bias came up for me that I wasn't even aware of, so it's
Yeah.
pretty cool.
It's a great tool.
Yeah.
Somebody said phone internet usage could potentially be both challenging and a safety threat. So did
Yeah.
you guys wanted to address that?
Yeah, absolutely. So phones are a huge thing, right? Every child almost, or a lot of children have phones. So that can be challenging, right? Some parents choose not to give their kids phones at all. Some parents have a certain age they give phones, and you may agree or disagree with that. That could be a safety threat. There are predators out there. There are dangers on that cell phone. There are things that kids can see that should not be seeing. So that's a perfect example of what we're talking about here. That's, just one of those gray areas. It could go either way. It could be a safety threat or it could be challenging. Maybe you don't agree with a family giving an 8-year-old a phone or a 4-year-old a phone, right? Maybe the 4-year-old is on their phone all day long, right? Maybe there's only video games, or maybe there's a 16-year-old who's driving and his parents don't want to give him a phone, and maybe that's challenging to you. So that's definitely one of those things that can go either way, and we have to pay attention when it does become a safety threat, because just looking at a cell phone, maybe that's challenging, but maybe it is a safety threat, where if they're talking to people or they're going to places that they shouldn't be going to on that phone. So those, that's a great example of what we're talking about in these areas where there's a lot of gray areas, especially when it comes to child welfare. Unfortunately, it's just not black and white. There are those areas that we really have to look into, if that makes sense.
Right. And just ask curious questions, just like Christy was saying,
Somebody in the comments says my son told my mom he didn't get dinner, so he get a second dinner, right? So those are those things, those silly things that kids like to say. Thanks so much for this conversation. I really appreciate everything everyone's putting in the chat, and hopefully that this helps people to kind of look at things and not see everything as just black and white. So we will go on to addressing safety concerns. So how do we address safety concerns with a family when we see something come up without hurting the relationship between ourselves and the family? There will be times when we do see something that might be questionable, right? We want to keep that relationship with the family. How do we do this? And I'm going to be using an example of something I have seen in my work when working with a family. So I was in a home with a young mom. I walked in, she had a brand new baby sitting in a bassinet in front of the stove, and it was open. And she said, "Oh, he slept here. The stove has been open and on for like, I think it was 24 hours. It was on for a long time." So again, that's a gray area. Is that, I mean, there are definitely safety concerns there, right? But what do we do? Do I leave the house and immediately call CPS? The first thing we want to do is we want to raise awareness, right? Maybe they don't know the dangers of this. So there's the dangers of gas. If they have young children walking around, they could get burned. So we want to raise awareness by addressing the safety concerns and providing education. Maybe the family doesn't know. So we want to do that first and address that with them. Second, we want to try to find a solution and ask questions. So why are you using the stove? Why are we not having the heat on? Well, it turns out they had a landlord who the heat broke. It was the middle of winter. The landlord did not want to fix it. So we want to ask questions and we want to collaborate. Who can we collaborate with? Community resources. So what can we do about this situation? In this instance, the mom and myself called the landlord, tried to get it fixed. We collaborated with him, community resources. If the situation is more not necessarily the landlord, but maybe they couldn't afford, or they're having, issues there, go into poverty, and the heat was turned off, maybe we can use community resources to help them get that turned back on. So let's try to find solutions with the family. And then third, we want to try to create a safety plan. We can either use a task-centered approach or we could use a crisis-centered approach. So in this situation, it was a crisis-centered approach. It's middle of winter, she doesn't have heat, she's using a stove. How do we do this? Maybe it's finding temporary housing for the family, whether it's they stay with a family, maybe it is going to a shelter for the time being, someplace safe. So that's a crisis center response we could do. In that situation, we ended up having to call code enforcement. So, that was a crisis situation where we had to do that. Or you could use a task center approach. If it is a situation where, maybe the family can't afford it or, they're having issues somewhere else, we can give them tasks to do. Maybe we can do the task with them. So let's go try to find someone to get your heat turned back on. Maybe we can find some grants or, something to help you out with that. Maybe we can apply for HEAP. So there'll be tasks associated. So the family needs to apply for HEAP so that this doesn't keep happening. So we really create a plan with the family so it doesn't happen again. Maybe it's finding someone where we can get electric heaters or, something that's more safe than using the stove. So create a safety plan with them, whatever the situation is, and try to help the family work through this.
Right. And the family would appreciate this. We're talking about engaging the family, in child welfare. If we help them address the concerns before they become safety threats, that's and so that they know for the future, because we're not going to be in their lives forever. So if they know for the future on what the proper way to do and what the alternative is, what is the safety plan? How do we apply the safety plan? We have to make sure that we create a safety plan with the families, not give the families a safety plan. I know I've been at fault with that, saying, okay, we got to call code enforcement. This isn't right. And the family said, no, don't call code. I'm not going to one of those, homeless hotels. Please don't call code. I'll live with it, So then come up with a different safety plan, which suits the family. Let the family tell you what will work for them, not us tell the family. Well, I'm sure we all know that, but, I'm just saying I kind of had to learn it the hard way a little bit. So,
No, you're absolutely right. And, I don't mean to keep going back to this, but that's it makes me think about, you know, different cultures who might not be accustomed to the United States, who might not know what's out there, who might not know what's right, you know, what's might not know the dangers. And we want, you definitely are right. We want to use family-driven care. We can show the family the resources out there, but that let them be in the driver's seat and let them tell us what they want to do, you know. Especially a family that's been traumatized, right? You're we like I had said, we had called code enforcement and that's what the mom wanted to do, but you know, some families definitely don't want to go that route. They might be fearful of getting in more trouble. Maybe there is trauma from the past. So that's a great point. Thank you so much for Ginger
Right.
for bringing
I
that up.
just read Cynthia's comment in the chat, we read their rights, they say they understand their rights, but sometimes they're really just trying to get us out of their face, you know, like that's
Yeah.
kind of cool. I think in the references too, we put in some information about knowing your rights, what are your rights, what aren't your rights, and if we're not sure, like to support the family with resources for that kind of thing, Cynthia, to your comment, we could refer to the OCF website. They have the best practices there of what they would like, for all the workers in New York State to, how to work with the families. And, I've been through reading it and everything, and they really want workers to engage with the families, to teach the workers on how to engage with families to better support the families. And we're kind of like, as I said before, I hate to go on about this, but we're there to kind of help them bridge the gap too, So, okay, I'll be quiet now. Sorry.
So CPS reporting, what is that going to look like? So what if we have done all those things and we absolutely have to file a report? There are times when, there are times when we may have to file a report against a family. Um, yeah, someone said building rapport is so important. So, if there's times that you have to, by law, file a report, we want to try to keep that relationship with the family. So we, again, want to keep our safety in the forefront. If your safety is in question, you can bring a supervisor or a partner with you when your safety is in question. But also, again, just keeping that relationship with the family, being transparent about it, talking to the family when you can. I know some agencies would like you to call with the family if you can. So ask yourself, is that something I can do? Can I call with the family? And I just want to always go back to your agency's protocols with this. The mandated reporter protocols. We want to always go back to that, and what you're legally required to do. But we, just want to try to keep our relationship and be as transparent as possible when this happens.
Right. And usually, it's not like they won't see it coming if we're doing what we're supposed to be doing by supporting them, providing them knowledge, teaching them, and it's still not working, and it still becomes a safety threat. Then, we've explained it, the transparencies, we've explained it all before, we have to call it. But really, support the family before you report the family. If we've exhausted all resources and, there's nothing else we can do, then reporting might be necessary. I just kind of wanted to reiterate that. Sorry.
But sure. And so I'm going to give an example of something I've seen in a training before where there was a family, they had a huge number of cats in the home. They were causing issues with the air quality. They were causing issues with fleas. They were causing many, many issues that made it unsafe for the children in the home. And the family absolutely positively refused to get rid of any single cat. And at that point, the mandated reporter had to make the call, because by choosing to keep the animals, which I'm an animal lover myself, I can understand, in situations like that, both sides. But it was putting the children at risk. So that was a situation where the report absolutely had to be made. That's just one example. And so there are examples like that where the report absolutely has to be made. But just really talking with family. And, sometimes after the fact, we still can do those steps of making a safety plan with the family. Okay, this is where we're at. How can we make this better? How can we help you? Really, how can we help you?
Right. Can I just chime in now again too? You're talking about with the cats, Now we as family peer advocates, we have the ability to think out of our box, out of the box. We can help families with different ways where service providers or agencies, aren't able to. I mean, I've had where CPS can't even text a family where we're able to do stuff like that. We had a family, she had 6 cats. She loved those cats. They were having babies. I was able to find an agency where you can get the cats spayed and neutered for free. We got the boxes, we took all the cats, we got them spayed and neutered. We hooked the family up with the local humane society where they were able to get food and litter for the cats, every week, and all was good, so there's always think outside of the box, for things.
Yeah,
I just kind of wanted to share
absolutely.
that too.
Sure.
So
Okay. Go ahead, Ginger.
relationships after filing the report, that's a tough one. um there are situations as to where you've gone back, you thought about it, and you realize that you did have to file a report, or the family told you something that they didn't tell anybody else, and yet you have to report them. How do we rebuild that situation? How do we um get them to trust us again? For It's really, 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 difficult. It's hard. And if we just, I feel, and please share in the chat or come off mute if you'd like to share, different ways to address this, to be transparent, explain to them who, what, where, and why. This is why I had to do it. You understand, I'm a mandated reporter. We need to make sure that the family knows that we're mandated reporters. Help them identify and understand the reason for the call. Many families, like, based on culture and bias, again, they don't understand the reasons why a call had to be made, what the law is and what the families, think about like Safe Sleep. I'm sure we all have Safe Sleep. We have that form that we have to fill out, but yet how many cultures that all the family sleeps all in the same bed? So how do we address the culture, the bias, and what the laws are? Again, to engage with the families, to explain to them, to give them knowledge, collaborate with the family of how to resolve the issue so that it doesn't happen anymore, for the future. And again, create the action plan and the safety plan. Building trust after a hotline call, normalizing the fear, the fear of the unknown. We don't know what it is. I know I felt sometimes, and a lot of other parents, you're not a bad parent. Sometimes we just make mistakes. Sometimes we just do wrong things. Sometimes we're not aware of situations that we're doing something wrong. Let them know that they're not alone and that you're not a bad parent. If you go through, most of us, we all have lived experience, right? As family peer advocates, if we've gone through a situation and we've gone through the investigation stages and we were able to, whatever the outcome was, it makes you stronger, and it makes you able to better support the families, that are there, and build relationships with the families too, so, validate their emotions without minimizing them. That's another thing. We sometimes feel that people are overreacting to situations, again, because they're probably not sure about what the situation is. We'll go back to what we were talking about, Crystal, before, is knowledge is power. And we'll get to a slide about that in a few minutes. But, don't dismiss their emotions. That's like the worst thing that I think that you can kind of do, and explain the investigation process. There's another thing. I could send it out to everybody who is on here. It's just a little kind of brochure. It's a little bit old, but it's understanding the investigation process from start to finish. And it's very simple, and it helped me understand it. And I mean, how many times we go to court? We have no idea. I don't know. I'm just speaking again for myself. But if you can explain the investigation, they know what to expect. And, then in turn, they understand maybe what they can. I think if you have the information and you share it with the families, they can fight for themselves. They can empower themselves. They can go ask for a fair hearing if there's something wrong. A lot of times we see family court things maybe don't go the way that we think that they're supposed to be going legally. The family can challenge it, and fight for their own rights. So, empowering the families afterwards. I think we just kind of pretty much covered all that kind of stuff. talk through situations with them. If you're in a meeting with families, and Ashley, we were talking about this before, you know, between the CPS workers and the families, again, being that liaison, we know what could trigger a family, right? We're working with them. We're firsthand in their house, you know, talking with them. Workers, maybe what, they see them once a month, maybe, you know, if they're lucky. Sorry. So, you know, explain to the workers what not to do. Sometimes they want to trigger the family. They want to see them react. They want to get that worst part out of them, you know, and let the families know how not to react, how not to go that. And it's not easy, but it'll help them in the long run. What's the next slide? You got this one, Ash?
Yep.
Okay.
So stigmas, or you might use the word biases, associated with child welfare. So stigma is a negative thought or idea or assumption associated with a social feature, person, or culture group. So what are some stigmas that have been associated with people who have been or are involved with child welfare? So are there, if you want to put some in the chat that you've heard before, but maybe a family has gotten a report, so they feel like they're a bad parent, right? They're bad parents, exactly. Maybe they're bad parents. Maybe they're neglectful. Maybe, you know, Ginger has said poverty isn't poverty itself isn't it's not neglect. You know, if somebody is and facing poverty, that necessarily isn't just an issue. But you see somebody who's involved and you automatically think they're in poverty, and it's their choice. Maybe somebody said a stigma could mean that they're unfit, right? Maybe a person who maybe somebody's facing depression, or they're going through something, so their home is not as cleanly as what it should be, and there's, you know, they get a CPS report about it, which makes them feel even worse, you know. So maybe, you know, yeah, they're low class, I see. So maybe if their home is messy, that they're a dirty person, you know. There's a lot of different stigmas associated with that. And then I want us to think about, how do these stigmas affect the individual or family impacted? Even if a report comes in and it's unsubstantiated, how would that make the family feel, right? So somebody called CPS on them. They get a worker that comes out to their home, and you know, they probably feel terrible about it. And then they get a report, or, you know, a letter in the mail saying it's unsubstantiated. Maybe they're confused. They don't know what that means, but it still affects the family, right? Because they know that somebody called a report in about them, and then maybe, you know, they're thinking of some of those stigmas. So yeah, they're thinking about some of those stigmas associated. So I really want us to just kind of think about, you know, the stigmas associated and how those stigmas affect the family. Because if we know what they are, if we know what those biases are, the families who are living it, they also know, you know. So just something to think about. And then how do we confront the stigmas? How do we confront the biases? Historical and systemic inequities. Families of color and low-income communities often face disproportionate surveillance and intervention. Mandated reporter concerns. So everyone has biases. Some are known, some are unknown. You know, we can work to understand our own biases, kind of know what those are. I think we put in the chat that a test you could take to kind of learn if you have any biases and what they are. Speak out and speak up when you hear negative thoughts or assumptions, whether, you know, it's another service worker or another service provider in the home, and you hear them making comments or assumptions about the family. Maybe pull them aside and explain that they have a bias. You know, we don't always know what our biases are. Maybe other people don't necessarily understand what those biases are. Raise awareness and be open to conversation. So if, you know, if something is challenging to you, maybe work to become more educated on the family's culture, be open to conversation, hear their story. Support education and advocacy. So again, that education right there, be open to learning about other cultures, be learning to hear about how other families do things. The active listening and advocacy. And then we're going to go over some of the causes of fear and mistrust. Fear of judgment. This is a big one. I feel like anyone who is a parent might have had, fear of judgment. I remember when I had early intervention coming in. I had PT and OT coming in every week before they came in. I would like do a deep cleaning on my home. And if there's toys out, I would apologize. And then just one day, one of them said, it's okay for your house to look like it's lived in, So we all have those feelings of fear sometimes. And so it's important to acknowledge that the families we're working with have some of those fears too. And, they might not come out and tell us what those fears are, but just, be aware of those and, act with empathy. Fear of being reported to a child welfare, especially, if they're getting new service providers, if they're getting new services in their homes. We talked a lot about implicit biases, whether it's us, whether it's other service providers. Lack of communication is huge. We want to communicate with the family. Like we talked about before, if you do have to make a call, if there's safety concerns, and be transparent. We want to acknowledge that families' negative past experiences and trauma. So just be aware of that. And then we can act appropriately when we are aware of that. And not being involved in the decision making. The family should be involved in the decision making every step of the way. We want to put that family in the driver's seat and let them choose. And then how do we work through the fear? Transparent and education. Educate yourself and be transparent with the family. Community-based solutions help the family find resources in the community. Family-driven care is huge. Again, like we said, allow that family to be in the driver's seat. They are decision makers. They're the ones that are driving that car. They're leading the way. We're just, we're there for support. Active listening and empathy. Listen to this family story. Try to be understanding. When it's appropriate, you can share your own lived experience. And then we are going to talk about bridging the gap. So how can FPAs collaborate with the family and child welfare? So, Ginger had mentioned before that we have a unique perspective. A lot of times we're meeting with the families at least weekly, and being that we're peers, we do have lived experience that's different than perhaps other service providers. So we can work with the family to bridge that gap and help the family and the other service providers work as a team rather than me versus you. The biggest thing is teach the family advocacy skills, letting them know they're the experts, teaching them to use their voice, advocate for themselves. If something doesn't feel right, speak up about that. Facilitate phone calls and meeting first to teach them to do so independently. We've heard do with, we've heard do for, but sometimes we can do for with, if that makes sense. So maybe the family needs to make a phone call and they're afraid to do so. We can make the phone call with them in the presence of the family so that we're modeling that behavior and teaching them what they need to do to become independent. We want to model behaviors in meetings, a lot of IEP meetings, or even working with child welfare. Emotions can become high. Ginger had said sometimes, families are pushed, so those emotions do come out. We can model behavior, and the more a family is empowered, the more knowledge they have, they can use that knowledge. Using a strength-based approach, so using that with a family. Pointing out the family's strengths, and then creating that team mentality. Okay, and go ahead, Ginger.
Okay. As we talked about, and as I've kind of reiterated through this whole training, is knowledge is power. I like what Christine said in the chat to encourage families of their rights. I added again, if you guys want to look it up, it's called What Happens Next. It's a video from prevention. It's kind of old, but it can explain to you the whole process. Therefore, you can explain the whole process to the families. They know about it. They're informed. They know what their rights are. There's a thing about their rights too in there. And they can stand up for themselves. They can advocate for themselves. And isn't that like the point of us, is that we want to teach the families on how to do these things for themselves so that they in the future can prevent any kind of, child welfare involvement for themselves and their families, ask the family, what are their wants and needs? What is it that you need? What is it that I can help you? And I think right from the very start, when we go and we knock on the door and we say, hi, I'm not CPS, I'm here to help you. Right then and there, we've kind of, you see them relax a little bit more, for me, Google is my best friend. I don't have all these degrees and everything else like that. I Google stuff. I ask for information from New York State. I look at the OCFS website and I get as much information that I can to provide the family, with resources, with knowledge, with resources. Like, did anybody know that there are actually 18 resource centers throughout the state of New York for families to utilize? I didn't know that for like a long time, What did Crystal say? Crystal said a lot of parents are afraid to speak because the CPS team will add more services based on a parent's frustrations, and that's not fair. Exactly. And that's kind of like we're there, we're there to bridge the gap between CPS and the families. Maybe the families don't need, let's say parenting classes because they've took 10 of them already and they know how to parent. They just made a mistake. We can advocate for the families until they're able to advocate for themselves, Another thing that helped me and that I try to help families with is provide a list, just a checklist of all their service providers, their email addresses and their phone number. They can stick it on the refrigerator. They know who to expect. They know who not to expect. Somebody is out their door that's not one of their service providers. It's somebody else, they don't have to answer the door because they don't know who the person is. But if they don't know who their providers are or what's going to happen next to them, again, that fear of the unknown piece, this is a good way to prevent that from happening,
Okay. And the last slide is cultural responsiveness. We talked a lot about culture. It's very important because balancing cultural traditions with ethical considerations. It's essential. It's essential to protect individuals from harm while still honoring their cultural identity. Sometimes cultural norms may be perceived as abusive or neglectful. So, we're not going to go over this question right now for lack of time, but just think about, what kind of cultural norms have you experienced from families? And again, we just want to think about, is it disagreeable or unacceptable? One size fits all does not work for families. So think about their culture. We want to try to honor that while keeping the family safe. These are the references that we got some of the things from the Child Welfare Glossary. And then we have the New York State PDF where we got some of the statistics, and then a parent's guide to New York State child abuse and neglect laws.
And again, you'll be able to see those again as when they're posted on the CTAC website.
So yeah, someone mentioned in the comments, now with the situation with ICE, a lot of families are afraid. You're right. And it's unfortunate when families can't live within their culture because of that fear. So it's something we definitely want to take into consideration.
Mm-hmm.
So we are ending our time here, but we do want to take a few minutes to address some of the questions that were in the chat. For those of you who can stay, we will extend by about 5 minutes to talk through some of those.
Somebody had in the chat, what do you do when the CPS or the case planners don't respect you or they don't listen to the parent's voice? I've always gotten above their head and spoken to the supervisor. There's always one person higher than them, who works at the agency, send an email. Well, I would call them and send an email, just to let them know. And that way, that you've done what you can to support the family.
And I think on the parent side, I would say empowering the family and using that family-driven care. Parents are the expert. Bottom line, parents are with their kids you know, most of the day. They are the expert. They know what they want for their family. I think the more we, the more a family feels empowered, the more knowledge they have, the more confidence they have, I think the further they're going to get, really.
So somebody asked, are the 13,000 children in foster homes due to children being removed to substantiated reports, or is that just an overall number?
That was just an overall number, and that you can see the statistics in the references. But yeah, that was an overall number. There are a lot of that statistic page. There are a lot of interesting statistics in there. We just couldn't cover them all.
Right, and within the last year, those statistics have gone down, especially with the children in the foster care.
Mhm.
How many times can a report be made for the same concern?
So that's something, you know, I'm not completely sure of. I think, you know, they do have to investigate. They do have to investigate every time a report is made. Ginger, I don't know if you have any more information on that. I know that, you know, when a report is made, CPS does have to investigate it. So it
Um,
could be in number, I would say, you know, any number of times. But Ginger, did you want to add something?
no, I just want to say I'm not an expert with that
Mhm.
that part, but I would refer them again to the OCFS website.
Yes, exactly. You know, people can call in reports, and then it's up to, um, you know, the reporting agency to decide whether or not they take that report. And you know, if they do take the report, it does have to be investigated. So if it is, you know, something that's serious, and the report is taken, I'm sure that every time they would have to investigate that. So.
Yeah, that is what they share on the mandated reporting, is that just because you know somebody else reported something, if you see it and it's still a danger, that you would still have that responsibility to report as well. But they do have that database.
I think
Um,
educational neglect is a big one there that you see that a lot where there's multiple reports made. Go ahead,
yeah.
Chris.
So somebody asked, Ashley, can you share how the cat situation ended up?
Uh, I know that um, CPS investigated it, but it was in a training, so there wasn't, you know, there wasn't an answer,
Um,
unfortunately. You know, it was a you know, investigation, but it was just an example of, you know, a situation where that there wasn't, in that situation there wasn't a choice other than to call, and an investigation had to be made, you know.
Mhm.
Or
Christy,
investigation had
someone asked if they would get a certificate for their attendance. I was going to ask the CTAC administrator.
Oh,
so,
I just answered that.
yep.
Okay.
So somebody said that if your teammate made a report, on the family, who would explain the call to the family if it's appropriate?
say if I would say who whoever has, I don't want to say a better relationship, but if you're working with a family and you have a good relationship with a family, um, you know, I would go into that. If the coworker's working with them and they also have a good relationship with the family, they could explain it. I would say honestly, whatever is less harmful to the family, we always want to keep them in the forefront. Whatever is less harmful for them, we want to be able to work with them as long as possible and help them. As our bottom goal is to help the family. So I would say, you know, it really is situational. And it depends on what your relationship is with the family. It depends on what the coworker's relationship with the family is. But whatever is less harmful for that family, if they're more willing to listen to you and you're able to kind of do some of those after steps where you get that family help and you work through them, I would say you. But you know, if again, if your coworker has that, you know, the relationship where they're able to do that, I would say them. So I guess it's really situational, if that makes sense.
It's a collaboration, right?
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
communicating between the two of you and making a
Mhm.
plan that's best for the
Yeah.
family.
Exactly.
So how does somebody or a provider support a family who's experiencing a pattern of bias due to cultural perspectives? I
That
know it's
is that is a great question.
Mhm.
I, you know, I would say, education. So we want to collaborate with other service providers, right? We can determine how we act. We can address our own biases. Unfortunately, we cannot do that with other service providers. We cannot force them to acknowledge their biases. So we can collaborate. We can maybe maybe it looks like a team meeting where we're bringing the family together. We're having the family explain what their culture is, what those norms are. We can kind of look at is it unacceptable where it's an actual safety concern, or is it something that's disagreeable? And I would say to provide education, whether we work with the family to provide that education, they can educate others on what their cultures are because they're the ones that know it best. I would say it's a collaboration. Ginger, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
I think, just reviewing trainings is like cultural competency, trainings and review and understanding the family's culture and help them support and advocate to, the workers or whoever's involved with them of what their culture is.
And if it's Ginger had said before, if it's a situation with a specific service provider, go above their head. And if you have to, again, put the family in the driver's seat, if that's something the family would like to do, go above their head and go above their head. I just don't think there's room for cultural biases. We want the family to be able to live within their culture in a safe way to do so.
So
Also,
we
the
have
family
one
won't
last
wanna call,
question. We have one last question and it is 1:34, so I would like to end with this.
Okay.
I understand that being a mandated reporter is part of our job. However, we're still guilty of having biases and jumping to conclusions. Any final words on how we can change it?
Yeah, so there is a implicit bias test. Christy, was that put in the chat?
It was, yes.
It's by Cornell University. I think that is so excellent. There's multiple tests you can take to see if you have a culture, implicit bias in those areas. So really addressing your understanding and knowing what your own biases are, trying to work through those. And you might come across situations where you're not able to work through those biases, and it's okay to admit that and maybe work with your supervisor to find someone who's a better fit for the family. We want to keep that family's your safety, but we want to also keep the family safety, and not necessarily safety, but their life in the forefront and let them be in the driver's seat. So really understanding your biases, acknowledging your biases, and working through those, if that makes sense.
Sorry, I totally misspelled implicit. You can Google the Harvard implicit bias test and it will come up and there's tons of sections. It's one of my favorite things ever.
Yeah, it doesn't take a long time to do. I think it's a really good resource.
Also, just ask yourself the question, is it me or is it a safety threat?
And we want to thank everybody for coming. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Christy.
thank you everybody for coming. Thank you for all the questions and the interactions. Thank you, Ginger and Ashley, for your expertise in guiding us to better support families who are going through a really challenging time anytime child welfare is involved, no matter what the circumstances are. Again, the recording and the slides will be available on CTAC's website in the next 2 to 3 business days. And thank you for everybody who completed the survey. It helps us to provide trainings that are relevant to you in your day-to-day work. On behalf of Families Together, CTAC, Ashley, Ginger, and myself, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Bye, everybody.